Fair warning, so for some reason my voice has decided to act up, so if I degenerate into a croak halfway through, sorry about that. But all right. So in an essay which takes the question as its title, the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy asks, why are there several arts and not just one? The question, he writes, finds its root in what appears to be an irresolvable tension between two different concepts of art. On the one hand, we find the idea of an essence of art as a transcendental idea that goes beyond any given manifestation. On the other hand, we never encounter art in this transcendental sense, somehow floating abstractly on the ether. Instead, we only encounter immanent products of the specific technical practices that we call the arts. This singular plural of the arts is basic to our understanding of it. Nancy refers to the figures of the Muses in Greek mythology, who represented the spirits of creative production. He writes that, quote, the Muses will always have been several. So art has always been a force that has taken many different forms, each with its respective spirit. Any philosophical inquiry into art, then, must be two-sided. First, we must ask what art in the singular is. Right? To use Nancy's term, what is the force of art? Second, we must ask how this force takes different form in each of the arts. So, as Nancy writes, each of the Muses presides over a different form and has a different character, though we are nonetheless dealing with art in all cases. Of course, these questions become important again whenever we wish to add a new form to the pantheon of the arts. So I'm going to be tackling these two questions as the foundation for the primary question which I'd like to try to answer, which is, within this context, what would be the character of a ludic muse? If we are going to consider games within the discourse of art and of aesthetics, then in what sense can we do so? What is the aesthetic meaning of a ludic form? All right, so it seems apparently definitions are unfashionable, so allow me to be unfashionable and start with a kind of basic definition. In its roots in ancient Greek, the term aesthetics relates to sensibility, right, to perception and to that which is perceived. Accordingly, in the tradition of Western aesthetics, which in its contemporary form has been largely shaped in the wake of Kant, the aesthetic object is that which foregrounds its own appearance. Gerard Genet has argued that this self-presentation has two aspects. The first of those is the immanence of the artwork in a material, extra-functional invariant, whether that is a block of marble, in this case, pigments arranged on a canvas in the form of a painting, or a sequence of verbal signs in a novel. Now, interestingly, for us at least, Genet does consider games within his taxonomy of artworks, although only in passing. He considers games in the same category of immanence as artworks with an improvisational character within a fixed structure, such as some kinds of dance or jazz music. There are many points we could talk about in that, but I'm going to pick on the fact that what he considers to be an artwork is not, as in here, it's not the game of tennis or chess, but a particular playing, a game of tennis or a game of chess. For example, Federer against Nadal in the 2008 Wimbledon finals. I know nothing about tennis. I Googled best tennis match ever, and this is what came up. Feel free to disagree with Google. So by Genet's understanding, the material invariant in which a game is immanent is the set of actions performed by the players during the course of the game. He is not alone in reaching this conclusion. Alexander Galloway has argued that with video games, the work itself is material action. And Graham Kirkpatrick, similarly, has argued that gameplay is an embodied practice, consisting of actions, and, perhaps with an echo of Jeanette, considers the parallels between games and dance. But the immanence of the artwork in a material invariant is only half the story. The artwork achieves its aesthetic realization when this immanence is transcended in the direction of an aesthetic idea. In the Kantian tradition, this transcendence of the material involves the foregrounding of the work's form. Kant writes that the consciousness of the mere formal purposiveness in a representation through which an object is given is the pleasure itself. It's in the appearance of the form itself that aesthetics finds its domain. So here what form refers to is the structure of the phenomenal experience of the object. And form here refers to the spatial and temporal distribution of the recipient's experience of the artwork. So, again, as Kirkpatrick writes, to understand the form of games as aesthetic objects, we need to understand what shapes and patterns they take in experience. Maybe we can read an echo here of Gadamer's linking of art and play. Gadamer argued that play can be understood as a comportment or a patterned movement, which constitutes a self-presentation. But we still need to ask, what is it that achieves self-presentation? At this point, the path I would take will diverge from that taken by both Jeanette and Gadamer, who both mainly frame the ludic aesthetic object not from the standpoint of the player, but from that of a spectator. This is especially clear in Gadamer, who argues that play achieves a transformation into structure in the form of the artwork. Right? The act of playing recedes behind the pure appearance of that which is presented. And I'd argue that a different approach to the aesthetic character of games is required, one that asks what form they take from the perspective that Ollie termed the game as played, that is, from the player's perspective. This doesn't change the fact that the material invariant of a game as an aesthetic object is a set of actions, but it does change the form that these actions take in experience. What we need to consider is not the form of the experience of the action as perceived, but the form of the experience of the action as performed. So if we're asking what the aesthetic meaning of a game is, then the carrier of that meaning is the experience of performing the action of the game. I'm going to be coming back to that later on, but in order to engage with this question, we need to step back a moment to again consider art in the general sense, and to ask, what is it that is brought into presentation through the form of the work of art, through the form it takes in experience? This is the question that Nancy tackles at the start of his essay, in order to conceptualize what he calls the force of art. Now, the framework Nancy draws on in order to tackle this question is that of existential phenomenology. In particular, he draws on an argument made by Heidegger in the essay The Origin of the Work of Art, namely that to be a work, in the sense of a work of art, means to set up a world. Now, what Heidegger means by world here is best understood with reference to his development of that concept in Being and Time. Here, world is defined as the basic complement to human being or Dasein, which is understood precisely as being in the world. So as such, world is not simply what he calls an ontical concept, referring to the set of entities encountered within the world, so those entities which I, as Dasein, am not. It's not the world out there, which is separate from me, but it is that wherein a factical design as such can be said to live. It is the ordered existential sphere of human being, an arrangement of the sensible and its associated mode of being in the world that unfolds as a network of existential practices. Heidegger, and in his wake also Nancy, argue that though the world in this sense is that in which we always already are, as beings in the world. For that very reason, it is not available to our perception. Heidegger then argues that it is in the work of art that the world and being in the world can, quote, attain to unconcealment, right? So be brought forth into the realm of the sensible. To quote his own example, Van Gogh's painting of a pair of well-worn boots invokes the world of the peasant who wears them. Heidegger writes that the image contains within it, and he uses somewhat flowery language here, right? The toilsome tread of the worker, the dampness of richness and this of the soil, and so on. I'm not going to read all that. In short, the painting brings forth the world within which the peasant that Heidegger imagines has her existence. The function of art, then, is to bring forth this world into presentation. It is with an echo of this that Nancy writes that, quote, art is there every time to open the world to itself. Keeping in mind, of course, that this is not the world understood as simple exteriority, milieu, or nature, but, as he says, being in the world manifested as exteriority and exposition. There's one important point I will emphasize here. To return to Heidegger, this idea of world as being in the world implies a threefold structure to worldhood, right, in which world, being, and the relation of being in are inseparable parts of the same whole. For this reason, Nancy says that the artwork's presentation of a world makes us feel, quote, a certain formation of the world, a certain shaping, but also inseparably, quote, a certain perception of self in the world. In other words, the presentation of a form of the world cannot be separated from a presentation of the human being for whom the world is a world. Now, that serves as Nancy's answer to the first part of his question. That is, what is the force of art in its sublime transcendental sense? It still doesn't answer the second part of his question. So again, why are the muses several? If the force of art is that of bringing forth a world into presentation, how does this bringing forth occur in different ways across the various forms of art? At this point, Nancy diverges from Heidegger. Unlike Heidegger's existential concerns, Nancy's interests are primarily formalist and aesthetic. So Nancy's answer to this second question is implicitly founded upon one of the main tenets of Kant's aesthetic theory. So recall the point that for Kant, the aesthetic object foregrounds the appearance of its own form. One of the reasons why it has this capacity is, he says, that aesthetic contemplation is disinterested. That is, right, I do not have any extrinsic interest in the aesthetic object. My interest is purely intrinsic and related to the appearance of its form. Just take a mundane example, right? And we've been, in this room, we've been sitting on these chairs for 3 days. Probably if I asked you to describe the chairs, you might not be able to go into that much detail. Right? That's because the chairs have interested us so far primarily for the purpose of sitting, not for their own sake as objects. On the other hand, if I'm in a museum and I see a chair like this, there's probably a pretty big "do not sit" sign right next to it. Right? I cannot use the chair for a purpose. Instead, I am only able to pay attention to its form for its own sake. This idea is made even more explicit in the aesthetics of Schopenhauer. He argued that cognition is always future-oriented. It restlessly strives forward toward its final purpose. But he viewed aesthetic cognition as an instance when this is arrested, an instance of cognition for the sake of cognition, with no other purpose but the pure experience of the perceived object. So if we understand being in the world as a network of existential practices always unfolding towards our purposes, then the things of the world always disappear as means towards these ends. In this context, aesthetic experience constitutes a special case of experience in which this is not the case, experience for its own sake. It's with this understanding that Nancy approaches the question of the singular plural of the arts. The first thing to note is that Nancy takes this argument a step further. His point is that in the aesthetic relation, it is not only the phenomenal experience of the aesthetic object, which is isolated from the lived unity of being in the world, so not the experience of the object, but also the experiencing itself. What art brings into presentation is not simply the sensed object, but the sensing, as a mode of being in the world. He writes that art looks at our look. It is in aesthetic perception that we reflect upon our perception and make it an object for ourselves. This is possible, he argues, because art breaks down the living unity of perception. Out of the lived unity of our experience of being in the world, art isolates a particular zone of experience, which is brought forth as experience. And it is here that Nancy locates the difference between the various forms of art. His argument is that each form of art isolates a particular aspect or zone of the experiential unity of being in the world. So, for example, painting isolates the perceptual aspect of the lived unity of being in the world that we call seeing, and in thus removing it from the network of signifying and useful perception, foregrounds it in itself. So put differently, we're no longer aware only of what we're seeing, but of the seeing itself. But for Nancy, it's important to note that when an art form isolates one aspect of our being in the world in this way, it doesn't leave us only with a fragment or an incomplete part. Instead, he argues, I quote, out of something that was part of a unity of signification and representation, it makes something else, which is not a detached part, but the touch of another unity. What he's arguing is that the form of the artwork gathers this one isolated aspect of being in the world into a new unity, right? A new phenomenal world, which implies not only a world, but also, as we said earlier, a being in the world, and a being that we are towards that. So, to take his example, in front of a painting, we comport ourselves in the manner that painting expects of us. Right? We stand at the right distance from the painting. We let our gaze move between the elements of the painting. We step back and try to subsume these elements into an ordered unity according to rules like composition, symmetry, color, line, and so on, in order to bring the painting into the unity of a formal world. By doing so, we are engaging in a pictorial mode of being in the world and revealing ourselves to ourselves as pictorial being or pictorial subjects. So, if that's what, if painting makes us a pictorial subject through foregrounding the element of our being in the world that we recognize as seeing, what happens when we are turned about into ludic subjects? Right? What about the ludic muse? What aspect does the ludic artwork bring into presentation through making us ludic subjects? So first of all, I'll note very quickly that there is justification for considering play within this discourse of aesthetics. In particular, Eugen Fink's existential approach to play bears more than an echo of Schopenhauer's argument. Fink's argument is that play is an essential existential phenomenon which stands against, over and against the other phenomena of our existence, removing them from their teleological purpose orientation. Play, by his understanding, stands for the existential phenomena of our being in the world, modeling and thereby presenting them. As Sebastian has put it, play is a specific way of engaging with being or with one's existence, since it makes some essential laws and structures of being experienceable. So, to put the question directly, if painting, for example, looks at our look, what aspect of our being in the world do games isolate and present? Well, the answer should be apparent if we look back at what we saw earlier on. when I said that as aesthetic objects, games are immanent in the set of actions performed by the player. As Merleau-Ponty makes clear, acting is just as fundamental a means of relating to the things around us as perceiving. So we could conclude perhaps that the ludic art, in isolating the zone of action from our unity of being in the world, presents our own acting to us and makes it visible. There's one final problem we need to face. If aesthetic contemplation demands that we perceive its object disinterestedly, with no goal in mind, then an aesthetic action would have to be something like what Merleau-Ponty calls an abstract bodily movement, which is his term for a bodily action that is not directed towards a thing, or that has no goal. That is just done for the sake of the gesture itself, like extending my arm in a dance. But ludic actions don't quite fit that description. Unlike the movement of an arm in a dance, the swing of a tennis racket is directed at a material existent, right, the ball, and this performed with a very clear goal, returning a serve. Same with an action in a digital game. If I'm mining coal in Minecraft, right, I have a very specific purpose in mind for that. So we need a different understanding of ludic actions as aesthetic. As Gadamer writes, play always presents the player with a task, and a lot has been written about the goal-oriented nature of games. And also, ludic actions bear reference not only to goals, but are also determined by the material contingency of the objects of play. Fink has said that play is always a confrontation with beings. And this brings us to Ollie's concept of the gameplay condition, which we've already talked about over these 3 days. So perhaps a way of understanding this is through considering ludic actions through the unity of a practice. As defined by Paul Ricoeur, a practice is a relation between a teleology and a systemic ontology. So when encountered by the subject, this relation gives rise to action chains, which bear a unity of configuration. Ricoeur gives the example of the practice of farming. That can be understood as a relation between a system comprising soil, crops, the sun, rain, and so on, farming equipment, etc., and a teleological orientation towards the production of food, which resolves itself as a vocabulary of actions such as plowing, sowing, harvesting, watering, and so on. Ricoeur gives great importance to practices in his theory of selfhood and identity. He argues that practices are the main building blocks in the construction of our own self-understanding as beings in the world. So, the parallel to games should be clear, and just to draw this up to a conclusion. With respect to games, we've already talked about this presence of a teleology and an ontology of things to be engaged with. The idea of a vocabulary of actions as defining a game is also one that has been explored. We've seen it brought up in Jeanette's aesthetic approach to games, and other people have written about this, such as Chris Crawford. Rune Clevier has drawn on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological framing of consciousness as being defined through an I can that we extend to the world. And he has argued that games, again, present us with these possibilities of practice. He argues that in games we get to be a different I can. We get to explore this foregrounded practice. So, last slide. To bring this all together, I'll just introduce and end on this, the idea of the game world. So the idea of a world of play is expressed by Fink as an ontological domain within which both the plaything and the player gain a new significance. A doll becomes a child, the girl playing with the doll becomes the child's mother. So the play world is a world in this Heideggerian sense I've been talking about here, an existential sphere in which things are arranged to us in their readiness to hand, and which drive us towards a particular being in the world. So, of course, the term game world is widely used with a variety of significations, but the sense in which I'm using it is, I think, close to the way that Ollie uses it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ollie. And when he writes that games are worlds for their players in an experiential sense. So the game world is an existential domain, as a being in the world defined through an existential practice. So as Sebastian writes, and I conclude on this, right, existential phenomena are repeated in play as if they were from a world in a world, or a life in a life. It's in this way that a game presents a practical being in the world, involving the player as a ludic subject, organizing the game world as an existential sphere around herself. So my claim would be, if we want to consider games as aesthetic objects in their character as games, then perhaps this is what we should be considering. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We were a couple of minutes beyond schedule, so you were almost on time. Okay, questions?
Yeah, Daniel, it's, as always, it's fascinating to listen to a talk of yours, especially because you go so deep into the history of theory and you pull out always like only the important tiny bits of the theory and then bring them together. So overall, I like it very much. I just want to flag out or give you just like one warning, because when you buy into theories like, especially by those elderly image theorists like Nancy, and I could name a lot more that tend to do the same, somehow they lose their rationality in their late works, because they start to think that the image itself is doing something. And with those metaphors like the image looks at you and all that stuff, that's kind of mysticism. So I would say just stick to the tradition of aesthetic theory. And I mean, as you mentioned, that Kant is saying, okay, the moment of aesthetic experience is that of a kind of contemplation in which we do not care about the object other than for its own sake. So we don't care what we can do with it, if it is true, etc., etc. The only difference is that if we watch an aesthetic image, it doesn't move. If we watch a movie, the images move. We don't watch aesthetic images, we watch a moving image. And if we play games, we use interactive properties, but do not care if they are true or not, if it's a waste of time. It's an aesthetic experience. So, you know, I'm completely with you, but I don't think you have to use those metaphors in which an object is doing something, because I really think that's mysticism. Thank you.
All right.
I agree.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for that. Nancy's idiom of writing tends to rely on kind of certain usage of metaphor and simile, where, he does say specifically, art looks at our look. I don't necessarily interpret that as a mysticism. Right? It might be a kind of overwrought way of putting the matter, but I think what he's saying in that particular instance, for example, is simply that art as a practice involves, a self-regarding gaze on our part, on the part of the artist, right, as engaging in this practice. Art as a discipline establishes this look that, in engaging with art, we ourselves inhabit in performing the practice of art. I don't necessarily think that, this particular essay, at least, from '96, falls into this kind of danger of mysticism that you're flagging up. I might perhaps see what you mean in terms of the later essay, which I quote, his 2010 essay, Art Today, where the language is perhaps even more overwrought. But I would feel that perhaps with Nancy, that's more of a question of writing style rather than conceptuality. I might be wrong. Yeah.
Daniel, thank you. I like the path you're taking. I don't know if I like exactly where you've gotten to it yet. Let me raise two concerns. First, it seems as though, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that every single instance of gameplay will be a work of art, according to this analysis. And it seems to me there are some experiences and instances of gameplay which approach art and others which don't at all. So that's the first issue. The second issue is oftentimes we separate aesthetic pleasure from art. So we get aesthetic pleasure from various sorts of things, waterfalls, sunsets, that we don't really classify as art. We oftentimes get aesthetic pleasure from playing games. But that aesthetic pleasure doesn't necessarily convert into a work of art unless there are other qualities there, such as, for instance, purposiveness and other sorts of things. So that's the second issue I'd like you to comment on.
Mm-hmm. Could you make it short?
Yeah, all right.
Thank you.
I'll try.
Please.
I'll start with your second question. Yeah, definitely, especially if we look at Kant's original formation of aesthetics, it's not really very much directed at the artwork specifically. Like most of his examples refer to natural objects and to kind of a particular mode of relation to things in the world in general, rather than to a specific technical practice of art or to the artwork as we would understand it. So, yeah, I mean, aesthetics relates to perception in its original meaning. So it's not necessarily a mode of being which is necessarily tied to an object that has to have the label of art. And even in more contemporary art theorists like Rancière, he argues that within the 20th century there's more of a move towards a general aesthetic attitude which can encompass almost anything we want within it as long as we relate to it in this aesthetic mode. To answer your first question, is a game always art? One of the dangers of this kind of aesthetic discourse, which I feel like we have to be careful of whenever we're engaging with it, is it tends towards an absolutism which which kind of flattens the difference between individual artworks. Right? Nancy's approach to painting, for example, it doesn't really matter what's on the canvas, as long as it's a canvas and we call it a painting and it's there. Right? This doesn't give us the tools to express the difference between one art object and another. And aesthetics, there is this danger which needs to be avoided of slipping into this kind of medium specificity and kind of absolutism of the form. I think that is a danger which we do need to be careful of. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.